Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Let's talk about testing and clinical trials and models. Yesterday, it was pointed out during the task force briefing and elsewhere that there's a study which appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, not yet peer-reviewed. They analyzed 368 patients who were died or discharged from the VA hospitals by April 11th. Researchers found that 28% of patients given hydroxychloroquine died, while 11% died with normal care. HCQ did not have an effect on patients' need for breathing medicine. The antimalarial drug has been known to also produce serious side effects, including problems with heart rhythms. So it was essentially the conclusion of the study that was backed by the National Institute for Health and the University of Virginia. Suggests that HCQ is not the magic bullet. In the study, we found no evidence that the use of hydroxychloroquine, either with or without azithromycin, reduced the risk of mechanical ventilation in patients hospitalized with COVID-19. The FDA Commissioner, Dr. Scott Hahn, was asked about this study yesterday, and here's what he had to say.
This is something that a doctor would need to consider as part of a decision in writing a prescription for hydroxychloroquine. And as I've mentioned from this podium and in other venues before, what FDA is going to require is data from clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, hydroxychloroquine placebo, to actually make a definitive decision around safety and efficacy. But the preliminary data are helpful to providers. And doctors, I want to ask them to incorporate the data as we have it come forward. And it's not definitive data. It doesn't help us make a decision from a regulatory point of view. But doctors should incorporate that in the decision-making they make on a one-on-one basis.
And just the timeline on the clinical trials and when we will be getting a readout of that data?
So the good news is we have over 30 clinical trials. Now, the settings are very different. They're in the outpatient setting, they're in the inpatient setting, and also, I think very importantly, in what we call the post-exposure prophylaxis, meaning if you're a healthcare worker or a frontline provider and you've been exposed to the virus, take the drug for a period of time to see if you can prevent the development of illness related to the virus. So all those trials are in progress and will probably be early summer before we get a readout.
So early summer. So again, you take that study in concert with the other studies in HCQ that showed more promise than that study showed, and you are measured in your response. And this is why it is a doctor-by-doctor decision in consultation with their patients and the unique profile of individual patients, unique profiles, and why the conversation is never over. Right? Conversations about science, debates are never over. We're always trying to learn more. That should be the disposition. And when we learn more, we go in the direction of what we learned. And so there's no reason to overstate the promise of HCQ. There's also no reason to understate the studies that have shown promise. And we wait to get the sort of rigorous testing of it that will allow medical professionals like Dr. Hahn to make categorical statements about its potential utility as an antiviral therapy. How about that? How about that sort of sense?
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's the way we should do it with all this stuff too. Measured. And it's really interesting just on the idea of measured responses, because quick is always better. Is it? The fastest is the best? The fastest response is the best? Or is measuring twice and cutting once a better philosophy? A look at exactly that by some researchers at University in the Netherlands finds government effectiveness is strongly negatively correlated with the speed of the policy response. In other words, looking at national governments around the world, they find that the more effective governments have been those that were some of the slowest to respond with a national policy. So in other words, it was, the takeaway is what I just sort of foreshadowed, which is measuring twice and cutting once is a more effective way to approach problem solving than just being the first to apply what you think may be a solution. If there's the desire just to do something rather than do the right something. For more on this topic area, we're pleased to be joined again by Dr. Kevin Pham. He's a medical doctor, contributor to the Daily Signal, former graduate fellow in health policy at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Pham, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me again.
So let's talk about the big topic this week in the testing front, and that's antibody testing. That was also tackled at the task force meeting yesterday in terms of, how many tests are that are approved, how many tests are there being developed, how many tests have been approved, and what's the accuracy, and the importance, particularly with some of the serological studies that were coming out of California, Santa Clara, and L.A. County that seem to suggest the infection rate is a lot higher than the reported cases, but it's also a lot smaller than the projections that some have made about the percentage of populations by region that are asymptomatic but infected. So to the question of herd immunity.
Right. I think the high-end estimate of that study in Santa Clara was that the incidence was actually 50 times greater than the number of confirmed cases. I think that's a bit high. It's a bit high because it is also, it is taking a set of data and then projecting it, generalizing it out to the rest of the population. I think 50 times is a bit high, also because the study itself, in order to develop the sample, it recruited people through Facebook by saying, we have this antibody test, and come and get checked to see if you have the antibodies. So that would select for, it would bias for the selection of people who think they may have had something earlier in the year. And so I think that kind of skews the sample a little bit. So it's not going to be quite so high as 50 times the confirmed cases. But what we are seeing repeatedly is that the number of cases that went completely asymptomatic is actually much greater than we've been led to, or that we've believed up until this point, just because the virus is so severe for some people and then completely asymptomatic for other people.
Right, and so the implications of that is what exactly? Because the idea is, if once we get a sense of the percentage of the population that's been infected, but it has been asymptomatic, so they haven't registered in our case volume, we can then more accurately model what the potential infection exposure is if we were to reopen the economy, and then make assessments in terms of whether we have the infrastructure to handle a rebound of infections, and make decisions about how we reopen the economy as well.
Right. Anyone who's got the antibodies, they're going to be, they're going to be less susceptible to contracting the virus again and then developing the disease again. And I say less susceptible because it's not really known very well at this point how much immunity you have with these antibodies. And the other thing that should be known is that these tests they haven't been approved by the FDA, which means that they aren't shown to have a certain level of let's call it accuracy. There's sensitivity and specificity data that we just don't know right now. And so it's possible that we're getting a lot of false positives on these antibodies. And, that's important because if you're getting a false positive, then it's showing that you have antibodies to the SARS-CoV-2 virus that's causing COVID-19. But that it might not be the case because, there's a different coronavirus that causes just the common cold. And then there's the original SARS-1 virus from a couple of years ago that swept through, especially the California community. So it gives us a better idea of when we can really just start relaxing the regulations. But I don't want us to be too complacent with that. It gives us a better idea, but not a very good idea at this point until we know more information about the tests themselves. But we can kind of gauge where we are relatively. It's sort of like getting a gestalt about it all.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. In your article, you mentioned about screening at a hospital, labor and delivery wards. The 29 of the 33 were asymptomatic at diagnosis. And then of those 29 women, 26 of them remained asymptomatic while only 3 developed fevers.
Yeah, and that just reinforces that point. And again, there's going to be a sampling problem with New York City just because it's such a cramped city that you're going to get an overestimation of the number of cases. But again, it does suggest to us very strongly that the number of infections is much greater than the number of confirmed cases, because that's a very small percentage of women actually developing symptoms. It's not quite 50 times more or 50 times less than the asymptomatic cases, but it still shows that this has probably gone through much more of the population than we think. So, and that's using, I think that was using the RNA testing, so it's a bit more specific to the SARS-CoV-2 virus as opposed to these antibody tests, which is more likely to give a false positive. So, that could mean that New York is better positioned to reopen. I still wouldn't go too fast in New York City just because it's a very cramped area, and the subway systems that almost everyone relies on, even the rich and the poor rely on the subway systems. And the subway systems is probably one of the worst case scenarios for trying to prevent disease transmission. But still, it means that we are probably further along than we think we are. So there's a bit more progress that we have that we don't need to wait for.
It may also explain why New York City was the epicenter of the outbreak, is that subway system. And so perhaps one of the protocols in new post-COVID-19 America is going to be significantly less reliance on public transportation.
I think so. I think people are going to be much more skeptical of metro systems and of bus systems. But, in New York City, there's no way that they're going to be able to ever move away from the public transit system.
Exactly. And if exactly, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to stop you there. Exactly. And that needs to be put to everybody, doesn't it? We know, we have a very good idea that the spread was so bad in New York City because of the subway system. But in the real world, that subway system is not going away. So there's going to be risk. And we accept that risk, I guess, or at some point somebody will admit that we're going to accept that risk. But they're unwilling to admit, the press corps and those that are playing politics with this, unwilling to admit and concede that risk should and necessarily will, whether it should or not, it does exist everywhere in the country, including at a hair salon in Georgia. But that doesn't mean that you can change the way that human beings will interact in perpetuity, which seems to be the goal of, or the desire, whether they even understand the implications or not, of people who continue to say, until we get the virus under control, we can't do anything. Until we get the virus under control, we can't do anything.
Right, and I think there's many ways to actually mitigate that risk. As far as public transit systems go, places with a lot of trains, what you can do is run more trains and sanitize them more often. And then also, I think public health messaging needs to be that if you're going to use these trains, wear a mask, and then they should provide hand sanitizer at these train stations as much as possible. So we accept these risks, and there are a lot of ways to mitigate these risks by providing options for American people. I think, given the option, Americans will behave smart because they will behave in their own interests, right?
Yes,
so,
exactly.
Also stylists and stuff like that. There are ways to do this relatively safely, and then, but there's a risk, but the risk at some point is going to be outweighed by the economic risks. They're not two different things.
Yeah.
They are the same thing. We're talking about lives and livelihood.
What about the lockdown? A lot of old and sick people live in relative lockdown without a pandemic, normal times. And so does the general lockdown, actually make the situation worse because it slows down the sorting, the beneficial sorting of slowing down infections among the least vulnerable? Does it do the opposite of that because you have people sheltering in place rather than out? And as we're learning that the percentage of asymptomatic, or the number of asymptomatic, is a lot bigger than some estimated. Don't you want that to proceed more quickly than less quickly once we believe we have the health resources in place to deal with whatever may come, and while protecting the vulnerable?
I wouldn't say that I would want it to proceed more quickly because in the early sort of flatten the curve discourse, there was always the idea that the area under the curve would remain constant that's not necessarily the case because the curve, the area under the curve, the number of people who ultimately develop the disease, that depends on the speed at which it spreads. And so we've put a real hamper in the amount of disease that will be generated from this disease by lowering the reproduction rate so low from these lockdowns. So the lockdown definitely helped, and they helped us get the health resources online,
Right.
and they help us and they help us get the testing and all that stuff like that. So we're getting in a better position. But I do think also that we're also preventing a lot of disease in general by doing these lockdowns. Again, it's a balancing act because life and livelihood are not two separate things. So, it's helped so far, and we shouldn't resent the fact that we've gone through them. I mean, I know people have lost their jobs. Some people have committed suicide, gone back to drugs and stuff like that. But I think there's a positive side to those lockdowns, and
Well, there better be. I mean, we know what the negative sides are. There better be positive sides. That's what we're exploring. Just how positive are those positive sides?
Yeah, it's. I think we're at a point that we need to start relaxing things right now, which is really bizarre that we're seeing people are starting to get arrested for going to the park. I think if you can go to the park, I think that's a great place to go. Just just not in a huge group right now, but we're in a good place to start relaxing things. And I think the White House's plan to do this in a phased approach. Heritage Foundation has the National Commission, the National Coronavirus Recovery Commission too, that we're working on a phased approach that's safe and gets back to normal economic functionality as soon as possible.
He is Dr. Kevin Pham, is medical doctor, contributor to the Daily Signal, former graduate fellow in health policy at the Heritage Foundation as well. Dr. Kevin Pham, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me again. Thanks so much.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
The Lou Dobbs Financial Report is brought to you by Signature Bank, helping local businesses succeed. Visit signaturebank.bank for your commercial banking needs.
I'm Lou Dobbs. The state of Missouri is suing China for coronavirus damages. SBA may have